Thawing Glaciers. This unassuming looking land was printed in 1996 in Alliances. And no, you're not reading it wrong. It's a land that doesn't produce mana. They actually designed a lot of lands like this in the old days. Despite this downside, from the day it was printed all the way until 2002, it was a very strong and sometimes format warping card. In fact, it was such a problem that it got banned in 1997. However, as powerful as it once was, Thawing Glaciers does not look like an impressive card today. Most of today's Magic players weren't playing back in the 90s or early 2000s, so they have no idea just how great this card used to be. So, that begs the question, how good was Thawing Glaciers, actually? This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Hi everyone, I'm Nitzahone, and it's time for another edition of How Good Was It?, a series where I examine the competitive history of cards whose best competitive days are behind them. I always run a poll to determine the topic of these videos, so go check out the community tab if you want to have a say in the next one. This time around it was a showdown between two powerful lands from Alliances, Keldoran Outpost and Thawing Glaciers, and in the end, Thawing Glaciers won a close one. Before we take a look at the types of decks that Thawing Glaciers was played in, let's take a look at the card itself and break down how it works and what exactly it does. Thawing Glaciers is a non-basic land that enters the battlefield tapped, and as I've already noted, it doesn't produce mana. It does, however, come with an activated ability. You can pay one generic and tap it to search your library for a basic land and put it onto the battlefield tapped and then shuffle. And then you return Thawing Glaciers to its owner's hand at the beginning of the next cleanup step. Yeah, it's an aptly named card because it's absolutely glacial. Since it bounces back to your hand every time you use the ability and it enters the battlefield tapped, it can only grab you a land every other turn, and you have to use up your land drop each time to do it. Let's set aside just how slow Thawing Glaciers is for a moment and think about what it is that Thawing Glaciers does. Each time you use it, it effectively draws you a card. And sure, it only grabs basic lands, but those are cards. And if you have the time to use Thawing Glaciers multiple times in a game, it becomes a real value engine, since it's a single card that draws you so many cards. It also doesn't hurt that it thins out your deck and fixes your mana, but a lot of Thawing Glaciers' value simply comes from its ability to effectively draw you an extra card every other turn. In other words, although it's pretty slow, Thawing Glaciers is an inherently powerful card. And so, if we imagine a Magic metagame where the games are incredibly slow, Thawing Glaciers is going to be really good. And guess what? We don't really have to imagine this kind of metagame. We just have to look back in time. Fittingly enough, Ice Age Block Constructed was just such a format. Block formats don't exist anymore today. In fact, neither do blocks. A block was a sequence of, usually, 3 sets that were interconnected by lore and mechanics. A block constructed format is one where only cards from those sets are legal. In other words, these are sets with very small card pools. At the time of the Block Constructed Pro Tour in 1996, Pro Tour Columbus, only cards from Ice Age and Alliances were legal. It's important to remember that this was a time where Magic's creatures were far weaker than they are today. So if a deck wanted to be aggressive, they didn't exactly have access to the best tools. The red-green deck that won Pro Tour Columbus was running creatures like Woolly Spider and Giant Trapdoor Spider. These were the good creatures of this format, so even the aggressive decks weren't really winning games quickly. Meanwhile, Sean Fleischman was playing a 4-color control deck that was all about making the game go as long as possible, and that was pretty easy. After all, Ice Age Block had access to counter magic like Counterspell, Power Sink and Force of Will, and great spot removal like Swords to Plowshares, as well as sweepers like Yokel Hops and Pyroclasm. Because the deck ran 4 colors, the fixing provided by Thawing Glaciers was pretty important too. This deck's only creatures are 2 each, of Blinking Spirit and Ivory Gargoyle, both of which are understated but resilient creatures. This deck needed the game to go long to win with those anemic creatures, and it had all the tools to do it. Thawing Glaciers worked pretty nicely alongside Keldoran Outpost. This land makes you sacrifice a plains when it enters, and in exchange you get a land that can crank out creature tokens. That's a pretty good deal, and Thawing Glaciers prevents that from ever meaning you actually go down a card. It also made it easier to find one of your deck's 6 plains to get the outpost going in the first place. But probably the most important thing you could do with Thawing Glaciers and Ice Age Block Constructed was combine it with Zuron Orb. This 0 mana artifact lets you sacrifice lands to gain life, and Thawing Glaciers gets you a whole lot of lands in play, and if you combine these 2 cards, it becomes very difficult for any aggro player to ever take you down. You'd certainly beat them with your gargoyles and spirits before they could ever kill you. Ultimately, this Thawing Glaciers Zuran Orb combo gave control decks too much of an advantage in Ice Age block constructed, and both cards got banned following this Pro Tour. Not only was it powerful, it even made the games way too long and uninteresting, something Wizards of the Coast could ill afford in these earliest days of competitive Magic. However, Block Constructed was not the only place where Thawing Glaciers did serious work. It also very quickly saw play in Standard, including at the 1996 World Championship. There, it was played in a less controlling deck. We'd probably call it more of a mid-range deck today. It was a deck that looked to stick Urnamjin and then seize control of the game by blowing up lands with Armageddon. This deck was called Urnamgeddon because of the combo, but this deck also used Thawing Glaciers alongside Zuran Orb and also had land tax in the mix. These combined pretty nicely with the strategy of blowing up a whole bunch of lands. Land tax could make sure you had a bunch of lands in your hand to start playing after Armageddon, and Thawing Glaciers could also help you rebuild your mana in the aftermath. After all, you can bounce the Glaciers to your hand and then cast Armageddon before putting it into play again and starting the value train all over. Later that year at Pro Tour Dallas, Thawing Glaciers made its return to a control deck, where it was again used alongside the Orb. This deck's main win condition was recurring Hammer of Bogarden over and over again, something that was partly achievable thanks to all the lands you could search up with Glaciers. Ultimately, the Zuran Orb Thawing Glaciers combo proved to be too good for Standard too, and while Thawing Glaciers never got banned in Standard, the Orb did in June of 1997. Still, it wasn't like Thawing Glaciers was being played only because of the Orb, and it would continue to see play in control decks at US Nationals in 1997, and the Glaciers would achieve another top 8 at Worlds that same year. Once again, it was in a control deck. While this deck wasn't quite as reliant on Hammer of Bogarden to win, since it actually ran 8 creatures, those creatures took quite a while to win the game, and Wildfire Emissary really demanded that you have lots of mana, something Thawing Glaciers could of course help you with. But after 2 years as a control deck staple in Standard, Thawing Glaciers rotated out of the format in October of 1997. After a couple of years of inactivity, Thawing Glaciers started to see play in Extended in 1999. Extended was a rotating format that featured the last several years of cards, so it had a much larger card pool than Standard did, and yet Thawing Glaciers was still good enough to make an impact. Once again, it found its success in a control deck, although this was one that was super focused on getting a lot of lands in play. Kabuta piloted such a deck to a first place finish at Grand Prix Vienna that year, and you can see all the usual control elements. And this deck can just win with Palankron as a win condition, but the main card that the deck was built to abuse is High Tide. This makes your islands produce an additional blue mana every time you tap them, so the deck is filled up with cards that untap your islands, since you can now net mana when you cast them. Those untap effects included the aforementioned Palankron, which untaps 7 lands when it enters, and if you've cast High Tide in a turn, that's going to net you mana, and you can even keep bouncing it and replaying it. After lots of High Tides and lots of untapping, you can eventually cast Stroke of Genius to make your opponent draw their entire deck. So Thawing Glaciers is good here, partly for the same reason it was good in Standard control decks, but with the High Tide angle, making sure you get lots of islands in play was extra important. So you can use the Glaciers to set up your mana for a big High Tide turn. Hector Fuentes also piloted a Thawing Glaciers deck to a top finish in Extended in 1999. His deck, a mono-blue land destruction deck, was yet another control deck, but another one that could get extra value out of Thawing Glaciers. It not only gave you card advantage in the long run, the deck also had a nice way to use up all those lands you could search up. The deck's land destruction elements came in the form of Wasteland and Dust Bowl, lands that destroy other lands. Dust Bowl is a repeatable way to destroy lands, but you have to give up a land every time you do it, and if you're using the extra lands from Thawing Glaciers to get the job done, you're going to come out way ahead when it comes to cards. Forbid also synergizes pretty well with the Glaciers. It's a counterspell that you can buy back by discarding 2 cards, and because Thawing Glaciers returns to your hand, you're more likely to be able to rebuy it. Thawing Glaciers also works nicely with Morphling and Masticore, both creatures that get more insane the more mana you have available, and a bounced Thawing Glaciers can even be the card you discard to Masticore to keep it around in a pinch. By the way, if you want to know more about either of those creatures, there are episodes of this series about both of them. Anyway, Hector Fuentes wasn't the only player to make a top 8 with Thawing Glaciers in his deck at Pro Tour Chicago. Dirk Babarowski did it too. His deck still had a control deck core, including Forbid and Morphling, but it was also an Oath of Druids deck. These decks specialize in cheating creatures into play with the Oath, and while the deck could use the Glaciers just for card advantage, it was also extra important in the deck because it had some pretty challenging mana requirements in a format where there weren't that many dual lands. Plus the deck used Wasteland, making the mana base even worse. In this deck, Thawing Glaciers made it easier for you to get lots of green and blue mana so you could consistently cast your cards. Oath of Druids would be the regular home for Thawing Glaciers all the way through 2002 when it rotated out of the format. Thawing Glaciers never managed to find a foothold in Legacy or Vintage, formats that have always been renowned for being incredibly fast. There's just no time to fiddle around with Thawing Glaciers in any of those formats. And indeed, even if the Glaciers got reprinted in a standard legal set today, it's hard to imagine it seeing play in Standard or Pioneer. Creatures are a much bigger part of Magic today than they were back in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and aggro decks today are leagues better than they were during the heyday of Thawing Glaciers. You'll get run over if you decide you're just going to spin your wheels by activating Thawing Glaciers every other turn. So let's close things out with a look at the numbers. Between 1996 and 2002, Thawing Glaciers achieved 2 Worlds top 8s, 4 Pro Tour top 8s, and 11 National and Grand Prix top 8s. In Block and Standard, it formed a powerful combo with Zuran Orb, which made it very difficult for creature decks to ever outcard or kill the control player. This was such a problem in Block that Thawing Glaciers got banned, and such a problem in Standard that Zuran Orb got banned. While it wasn't quite as dominant in Extended, it did frequently see play in that format's control decks too, often in decks that could get additional value out of searching up a bunch of extra lands, like High Tide. So Thawing Glaciers is certainly a glacial card today, but during the late 1990s and early 2000s, it was one of the best non-basic lands you could possibly play. So that's the history of Thawing Glaciers. If you want to own your own Thawing Glaciers, because maybe you've got a landfall commander, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link. You can of course also find all of your other Magic needs in their store. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you stay aware of future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on the other episodes of this series, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.